Explanting an IOL is technically a lot more challenging than implanting one. The skill set required in actually doing so is significant, and it's very often that the surgeon who has operated on the eye is not surgically experienced enough to perform this technically rather challenging surgical procedure.
Let us now understand together what is the optimal orientation, that is, how the lens should be placed in the eye, how exactly it should be held prior to cutting it in the anterior chamber. I am a left-handed surgeon, so I would hold the lens with my non-dominant right hand in a manner like this. The grip on the IOL needs to be firm, and until the lens is now cut, we should not let go of this grip. Moving on to what should be the orientation of the lens. Now, I'm a surgeon who has made her main incision at approximately 65 degrees, which means the scissors that are going to be used to cut the IOL will be introduced clearly not through the side port but through the main incision. Now, if I need to cut the lens with the scissors entering the eye at about 65 degrees, the orientation of the IOL should be like this, which means that when I start to cut the lens, we always start to cut it at the inner edge of the superior optic haptic junction, and we move. So we start to cut it at the inner edge of the optic haptic junction, and we go all the way across, diametrically 180 degrees across, to end at the inner edge of the inferior optic haptic junction. So the orientation needs to be such that when the scissors enters the eye, it should very easily reach the proximal optic haptic junction. Now, the aim is to cut the lens from here all the way to the opposite optic haptic junction. One option is to go in here and continue to cut the lens all the way across. When we do that, we are left with two halves of the optic, each of which is connected to one of the haptic. Now, the haptic and the optic, as you can see, are all in one line. This allows for the removal of half of the optic, which is in line with one of the haptics. Another technique of bisecting this IOL will be demonstrated now. Now, if you were to cut the lens from this edge all the way to the other end, the scissors keep moving in a direction, opening and closing till you get to the other end. Moreover, often you don't always reach exactly the other end, because whilst cutting the lens, you may change the direction a little bit. I also find that when we try to cut the lens exactly from one end all the way to the other, there is a significant movement of the scissors in the periphery where you have a fairly shallow anterior chamber. So the other way in which you can manage this is, having bisected half of the IOL, you can rotate it around through 180 degrees. So now the distal part, which you would otherwise be cutting in the periphery, becomes the proximal part. Not only that, you're able to decide what should be the starting point of cutting at this edge, and the IOL can then be cut to once more giving you two equal halves of the optic connected to the haptic in such a way it allows for the ease of its removal. That is, when the haptic is held with the McPherson's and pulled out of the incision, there is no resistance to its removal. I'd like you all to note the actual thickness of the IOL down its center. The lenses are quite thick in the middle, thereby necessitating a significant opening of the blades of the scissors to be able to cut it effectively. We must take care when we are cutting the central part of the lens to avoid any damage to the corneal endothelium.
Under adequate viscoelastic cover, the surgeon uses either a Sinskey hook or a Kuglen hook and rotates the IOL into the anterior chamber. Adequate viscoelastic is placed both behind it to push the posterior capsule away as well as above it to protect the endothelium. The IOL, once stabilized with the help of strong forceps, is cut from the inner superior optic haptic junction all the way through to the opposite inner end of the optic haptic junction and therefore is bisected into two almost equal halves. In order to facilitate ease of removal, each of the two now bisected halves is now rotated to come to lie in line with the incision and is carefully removed through the main incision.